Friday at least in Canada, times closer than of late and the field much more bunched, kind of as predicted. I don't think this is because McLaren have got any sort of problem in getting their car set up for the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. I think it's more that there aren't many corners in Canada that penalise the Mercedes, the Red Bull and the Ferrari in the way that they do at some of the other circuits we've seen recently. And McLaren, if you like, in Canada don't have quite as big a palette in which to advertise how quick their car is. It's a fairly straightforward circuit, lots of high-speed braking, chicanes, yes, slow, medium-speed corners, but there aren't the long, fast and medium-speed corners we see at other circuits like Barcelona typically, or indeed the curbs and the traction emphasis that we have at Monte Carlo. So Canada's kind of even things out a bit purely because it doesn't give McLaren, as I say, enough exposure for some of the other things they do really well with their car. The other point about Friday in Canada is that the traffic was unbelievable. So I don't think we should read too much into the soft tyre runs either. Much more profitable, in my opinion, to look at the longer runs when, by definition, because they're out there with fuel in the car, putting on miles on the Pirellis that they, in theory, are going to be running in the race, and most of the cars were out on medium tyres on these long runs. That is when you can start positioning the car to get some free lap. And that's when we saw some significant changes, because quickest at the end of FP2, when they were all out there on these medium tyres, Max Verstappen in the Red Bull, he didn't get a very good run on the soft tyres at the beginning of FP2 because presumably they changed the setup, because as he went out the first or second lap he said terrible bouncing on the car, very, very twitchy going into corners. And one has to assume that before they put fuel in the car, they managed to raise the ride height a bit to give him a bit more ride, a bit more comfort. And as a result, Red Bull really quick. Having said that, Max's time all but equaled by Kimi Antonelli in the Mercedes on fuel, with fuel in the car, and George Russell just behind him. That says a lot, of course, about how well Kimi Antonelli is driving in Canada. There aren't any high or medium speed corners here really to daunt him, and he's looking really good. His short corners and his transitions really, really nice. And George Russell, meanwhile, on light fuel with a new set of mediums, devastatingly quick for one lap. A little bit more edgy, a little bit more spiky than Kimi in the way he's driving, but his car control and his judgment and his precision, as ever, just phenomenal. So Mercedes quick, light fuel and heavy fuel. Red Bull not so quick in terms of the lap time on the light fuel. Again, I don't think we should read too much into that. We'll see tomorrow where they go. But certainly with fuel in the car and with any sort of balance, Max Verstappen right up there as well. Lando Norris too, very, very quick on with fuel in the car towards the end of FP2 in the McLaren Mercedes. So they are right there. Don't think that this is a race where Mercedes will not be competitive. But interestingly today, Lando looking a little bit stronger than Oscar Piastri. Oscar having a couple of moments, one particularly significant moment I thought going into the last chicane, which is quite a quick chicane, right and then left and then the wall on the right on exit as they're coming out, of course. And Oscar did one of those leaning on the left rear and just pulled out a bit at the last minute, whereas Lando, because he does use the front end of the car a little bit more in the way he drives, looking absolutely perfect through there. Looks like a great circuit for Lando Norris, actually. Not as shorter corners as, say, Kimi Antonelli or Max Verstappen, but looking very good nonetheless in the McLaren. Charles Leclerc, the other short corner driver of great repute, where was he? Well, he did another classic Charles Leclerc on a Friday, just a ridiculous mistake very early in FP1 when he passed a slower car, a traffic thing on the outside, got on the marbles, braked a little bit too late into the first chicane. There's a short straight after the first hairpin, and then they go down to that first chicane. And he's on the outside on the marbles a bit, going a little bit too quickly. And instead of bailing out, he tried to go in, just ran onto the grass, straight into the guardrail, into the barrier. Didn't hurt himself at all, but hurt the Ferrari surprisingly badly. And yet another inexcusable mistake, really, from a driver of Charles' quality, just showing how susceptible he is on Fridays to these sorts of things. The car was so badly damaged that the survival cell had to be replaced, which meant he couldn't run at all in FP2. So there he was having to watch Lewis Hamilton drive the car. Lewis took quite a lot of time to get the car set up. I suppose it was a good thing from Lewis's point of view because he could really focus, the whole team focus on getting this car how he wants to drive it, which is the very, very late wide turn in now, leaning on the outside rear, a bit like Oscar Piastri, but a little bit more so. And there was one telling moment, I thought, going into that last chicane, the right-hander, where I just described Oscar having that moment, going into the first part, the right-hander. And again, Lewis had one of these things where, like Oscar, then had to bail out and go straight on, and got on the radio and says, "Come on, guys, you got to give me a setup that stops this happening." Before he said that, I was just about to say it's no surprise that happened, given the way he was leaning on the rear in the way that he never ever used to in a McLaren or a Mercedes. Anyway, they obviously did do something. I don't know what they did. They softened the rear probably, and got it very, or maybe gave him a bit more downforce at the rear, and got it pretty much to how Lewis likes. But Ferrari, if you look at the times, Max on heavy fuel 16.0, that's with a free lap. Kimi Antonelli shades slower, George 16.1, Lando 16.1, Oscar 16.1 as well, but a little bit coarser, COAR-SER. Lewis Hamilton 16.4, best on fuel. So whether or not Charles at that point would have been thinking, yeah, I can probably do a 16.1, 15.9, or whether he's thinking, well, that's the Ferrari are in trouble, we'll see tomorrow, I guess. But whatever he was thinking, really, it was not good enough from Charles Leclerc to be in the pit lane for FP2. Similarly, and it's as if he hasn't really been around anyway, and he had that wrist injury thing in Spain. Lance Stroll coming back for his home Grand Prix. And Fernando Alonso hasn't looked too bad at various stages of practice today. He's a little bit out of sync in terms of the tyres he's running and when he's been out, but he was quite quick with light fuel on the soft tyre, and then he continued to run the soft into the fuel runs, so not really representative. But not looking too badly. But Lance Stroll in his home Grand Prix, beginning of FP2, again, a little bit like Leclerc, I guess, with some slower traffic on his right, coming out of the second chicane, just ran wide, hit the barrier on the left, and basically broke the left front suspension. I mean, it's unbelievable that he would do that in his home Grand Prix. With the season that he's having already, it's one chance when the car's going to go half reasonably well with a Mercedes engine in the back, not too many corners to trouble the Aston Martin around here. And yet he's already done this damage to his weekend. So not very good from Lance Stroll at all. The other point to make is that both Williams look really good throughout on light fuel, particularly both Carlos and Albon looking very, very good. Heavier fuel, not quite as competitive as they were with light, which would suggest again that some of the teams out there, and McLaren, for example, running FlowViz all the way through FP1. So you've got to assume they were trying bits on the car as well. And Max doing lots of stuff, as I say. But in that context, Williams very quick on light fuel and not quite as quick on heavy fuel, maybe 3 or 4 tenths away, just a shade away from Ferrari, it looks like at the moment. But the Racing Bulls also very quick. Hadjar and Liam Lawson looking good in that car. Yuki Tsunoda, again, very disappointing in the other Red Bull. Yeah, Max having a bouncing problem and saying the car feels very nervous into corners. I suppose if that's the setup they've got on Yuki's car, he's going to be affected a lot more than a Max Verstappen by that. Max also saying the brakes didn't feel that good either, which would not be a great thing for Yuki Tsunoda, bearing in mind he is probably the last of the late breakers out there. So he's probably feeling he can't do what he needs to be able to do around Canada, although these days just being a late breaker doesn't add up to very much anyway. I spoke in the live stream about the section of road between turn 1 and turn 2, which is the left-hander at the end of the pit straight going into the right-hand hairpin, and how that's quite an intricate bit of road because they're coming out with a lot of load through that first left-hander, turn 1, loaded up the rear, obviously, on the exit, and then they've got to get the car stopped and turned into 2. And it's not only turned into 2, but they've also got to get the car rotated really well because after 2, there is a reasonable straight, and you can benefit if you get a great rotation and a great exit out of 2. So watching them today, it was interesting the difference I thought between Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri through there. Oscar's in this sweet spot of the car's comfortable to drive when I can feel the rear and I get on top of it and I don't make a lot of mistakes and I can always bring it home, and if things go well I can win the Grand Prix and beat Lando. And it's interesting to see what he's applied in terms of that logic, what he's applied going into that section of road, because he's not an early turn-in driver. He's got the potential to be, as I keep saying, but he isn't in 2025. And what he's doing, he's coming out of turn 1, letting the car run wide, and then not making any attempt at all to get the car over to the left for turn 2. He's just braking in a straight line into turn 2. Looks nice, but of course that means he's got a very, very slow rotation in the middle of 2. He's sort of going out wide, almost V'ing it, and then coming back across. And I suspect that Lando, who's coming out, and he is finding a little bit of a flat spot where he's able to get the car slowed with braking, still got lateral load on the car, but he's getting a little bit more room just to be able to get the car a little bit wider into two to give him a slightly better exit out of two. It's quite interesting, Lando being able to do that with the front, which Oscar, in an area where Oscar isn't treading at the moment, purely because he doesn't need to, really. Why does he need to start doing that sort of thing? He's got the best from the car the way he drives anyway. The other two drivers I thought looked really good through there. Well, actually three. Max, Antonelli, outstanding through that section of road, very like Max. George was straight line but super quick. But the other one, again, was Pierre Gasly, who looked really good in the Alpine there, even though the Alpine, of course, is a bit of a dog of a car. No offence, Dexter. So there we are. A quick message about the latest in REC watches. Big news related to Le Mans, which takes place this weekend. A 48-hour launch offer enables you to sign up for the best possible price for the latest REC limited DNA edition watch, a spectacular timepiece with a sundial crafted from the repurposed brake discs from the Porsche 956 chassis 106B, the Canon liveried car that Richard Lloyd, Dr. Jonathan Palmer and James Weaver drove to second place at Le Mans in 1985, and with which Palmer and Jan Lammers won the Brands Hatch 1000 kilometers in 1984. The 956 was effectively the ground effect development of the Porsche 917, built originally around an aluminium monocoque chassis, but subsequently, as was the case with chassis 106B, a much stiffer honeycomb composite. Richard Lloyd was a true pro both as a driver and as a team principal. For the specific development of his 956, he hired the ex-Lotus engineer Nigel Stroud to create a new front end featuring rising rate suspension and revised brakes. Developing approximately 636 horsepower from its 2.6-litre twin-turbo flat-six engine, the 956 very quickly became a classic, moving Palmer to say that the long-tail version he drove at Le Mans in '85 was one of the best handling and nicest feeling racing cars in which he ever sat. And as a closing fun fact, think of this. When Frank Williams had his road accident in 1986, two of the medics who effectively saved his life by the time we got him back into the London hospital in the UK, one of them was Dr. James Palmer, Jonathan Palmer's brother, also a doctor, and the other, the surgeon that actually did the tracheotomy operation on Frank and then really did save his life by doing that, was James Weaver's father. So sign up now for this soon-to-be-released timepiece of vibrant motor racing history. Details in the description below this video. In addition to REC watches, a big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, and to TrackNinja. To you, the viewer, thanks for watching. See you tomorrow. That was day one of the Canadian Grand Prix weekend, a race that was first held in 1978 when it was won by the hometown boy, Gilles Villeneuve. We said yesterday in the video, and indeed in the build-up to the Canadian Grand Prix, that this circuit was going to, in some ways, nullify the advantages that McLaren have shown over the last few races. Not that many opportunities on the lap for the McLaren to show to the opposition how good it is, and so it proved. Mercedes on the pole with George Russell, Max Verstappen alongside him for Red Bull Honda. Phenomenal qualifying session in many ways. McLaren gave it everything they got, but in the end they were beaten not only by two beautiful laps from both George and from Max, but also by a decision on that second Q3 run by both George and Max to run the medium tyre. The medium tyre looked very strong in the hands of George Russell yesterday and in the build-up to qualifying. Max used it to very good effect in Q2. Big question was who would go for the medium in Q3. It's quite a big ask that. Everybody traditionally always runs the soft tyre, the new sets of soft if you've got enough. But the medium tyre is looking very, very strong. It's relatively soft compared with previous years. This is the softest of the Pirelli range. And that medium was just brilliant around Canada in the hands of both George and Max. As I say, McLaren, you can understand we're going the traditional route of running the soft tyre. They've got this big margin in the championship. They've got a great race car. Why go into unknown areas when they can just rely on the package that served them so well? And that's what happened. Oscar Piastri qualified third. As for Lando Norris, yet another example of Lando under pressure in Q3 making a mistake, a classic mistake in reality at the beginning of his Q3 session in the first phase on a new set of soft tyres. He'd done well to get those 2 sets of soft tires, because he'd had to use 1 set more than Oscar to get to that point. Anyway, there he was on a new set of softs on a very good lap. But then the most basic of errors, just brake too late at the end of the long straight. The lap was almost over. All he had was that quick chicane right at the end. He braked too late, lost the rear, and then just had to go in a straight line. And I think it gives some idea of where Lando's at in his mind. The message then from his race engineer was just reboot, Lando, and think about your braking references. For a Formula One driver of that level to have to get that sort of message at this point of a Grand Prix weekend, at Q3, at the fulcrum of qualifying, is absolutely mind-blowing for me, because that should be something that is just absolutely part of the DNA of any racing driver. Brake references, that's something you discuss on Thursday, something you work out on Thursday. And I quite understand that at the end of that long straight, there's nothing wrong with having, I don't know, a piece of cloth, red cloth, blue cloth, something to show exactly where you're going to brake, particularly if you're on a good lap and you don't then try to brake later because the adrenaline's up. You just stick to your braking point. And as Jim Clark always said, and it still applies today, absolutely still applies, if you do end up braking a little bit too early because of the amount of grip you've got, just come out of the brakes a bit sooner. Do not ever try to brake too late under pressure like that, which is the classic mistake Lando made. And then on the second run, he'd lost momentum and he was never in the running. And he eventually qualified P7 behind the likes of Kimi Antonelli, Lewis Hamilton, and Fernando Alonso. And he should win, and he should have been well in front of those. Oscar had his moments too. He had a moment in Q1 when he lost it exactly where I was saying yesterday. He comes out of turn 1 very quickly, leaning on the car a lot, and until this point he'd just been straight lining it down into turn 2, doing a very slow rotation at that point, a sort of V rotation, and of course the enticement is to do that more and more and more, and lean on the rear, and then just brake as late as possible in a straight line, and eventually got the better of him, and that happened. Whereas Max, it's just a joy to watch. He goes through turn 1, and then he's the only thing he's thinking about as he's coming out of 1 is he wants to get a really good rotation and exit out of 2. And to do that, he's having to create, and we saw this on the onboard, he's having to create a minuscule moment when he's got the steering absolutely straight. And that's when he does his braking, and then he just floats the car into 2. I didn't see any other driver doing it that well today. George was pretty near it, but everything George was doing had a sort of edge to it, as it always does with George. You're always thinking, reminds me a little bit of what it was like watching Niki Lauda in his early days at BRM, understeery, difficult car, that P160, and any Surtees Formula One car, got to say, which is also spooky. And watching George, you're always getting that feeling that he's on the absolute edge. Yes, he's managing it perfectly, but zero margin. Max doesn't leave margin, but because of the way he drives, because all his movements are softer, he by definition has a bigger sweet spot in which to operate. That's the difference. And you never get the feeling with Max that he's on the edge. Yes, you see him very close to the wall, but it's not a frightening thing. It's not a wow. It's just like, oh yeah, he's got the car perfectly positioned. A bit like Fernando Alonso. Fernando drove beautifully today in the Aston Martin, I thought. Absolutely fabulous. Lance Stroll got back into action. The mechanics did a rebuild on the car. And again, he failed to get out of Q1. Absolutely pathetic. Whereas Fernando Alonso in the same car, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, P6. I mean, unbelievable. P6. And Lance Stroll not out of Q1. I mean, what does that tell you? Well, it doesn't tell you anything other than what we knew in the first place, obviously. So George Russell on the pole for Mercedes. Really, really good. Wonder if he would have got that pole if he'd gone out on softs at the end instead of mediums. I wonder. Because there's something about the medium, particularly on the Mercedes, and also it appears now on the Red Bull, that is just absolutely perfect for that car. So that's an interesting question that we'll never really have an answer to. Differences between Max and George aside, both of them unbelievably quick, both of them incredible laps. Where was the difference in terms of who got the pole? I think the Mercedes was just a good car from the minute it turned the wheel around Canada. It had a pretty good run through both days, no issues that we knew of, technical or mechanical. whereas Red Bull seemed always to have something going on. Max began the session by saying the steering felt strange. It was much heavier than it should have felt. And then on top of that, he was complaining this morning that the brakes didn't have the same feel, the same edge to them that they sometimes have. I mean, this whole brake thing with Red Bull's been going on a long time now. I've lost count of the number of times Max has complained about the feel of the brake pedal. And of course, that could well be an issue in the race tomorrow. There's probably no harder circuit on the calendar than Canada for brakes. Normally, if everything's working and they've got all the temperatures right and the drums are doing their job, no issues. But if anything is slightly off, Canada is the circuit that's going to penalise you. So it'll be interesting to see how the Red Bull goes tomorrow. If he's behind George, I suspect Max will have some brake issues. And of course, that leads to the question of the difference between the brake systems on the two cars. So far as I know, and the teams try to keep it really secret now, but as far as I know, the Mercedes is running carbon industry, basically, and the Red Bull Brembo, as they normally do. Oscar Piastri, P3, very solid P3. And what a result for him on a weekend where, as I say, the opposition was going to come much nearer to McLaren, and Oscar could be going into Canada thinking, well, if I come out of here finishing P2, maybe even P3, that'll be a good weekend. And guess what? His teammate, the guy's got to beat in the championship, and who he's leading, obviously, way behind him. So great qualifying performance for Oscar Piastri, and very, very good job. And then Kimi Antonelli, also on the medium tyre, both Mercedes drivers, but he was on a used set of mediums and he qualified P4. That was a great lap by Antonelli, and that was the difference. He's got softer edges than George Russell. He's not, as I keep saying, he's on very, very fast bits of road where there's a little bit of risk involved. Antonelli is not there yet. That is the difference between George and Antonelli. But when it comes to finesse and touch, particularly going into slow corners, Antonelli definitely has it over George right now, in my opinion. Lewis Hamilton ended up the quicker of the two Ferrari drivers. Charles Leclerc got it together eventually today and was looking really good going into Q3. And you thought, yeah, he's going to do Lewis here. He did him in Q2, but he didn't. And he had a big moment at the second chicane, blaming on the radio afterwards Isaac Hadjar, who did a great job to get the Racing Bull again into Q3. Blaming him for being there, and the dirty air meant that he lost downforce going into the second chicane, and then he had a big moment. But you know, when Max was on his quick lap, he had to pass 3 cars, and so I don't buy that from Charles Leclerc. I think that was just a mistake of, yeah, of course he was slightly offline, and of course he was slightly discombobulated by having to go past the slower car, but he shouldn't have had the moment that he had. He lost it going in, then he had another big moment coming out of the chicane, and as a result, he qualified only P8. So good for Lewis Hamilton. As predicted in the live stream, this was always going to be a good weekend for Lewis relative to Charles, because again, you know, this is a circuit where, in the same way that there aren't enough corners here for McLaren, interesting, great corners for McLaren to show how good it is compared with a Mercedes, a Red Bull, or a Ferrari. In the same way, there aren't enough Charles Leclerc corners here to trouble Lewis Hamilton. So Lewis did just a good workmanlike job. In a way, you'd like to have seen him ahead of Kimi Antonelli, but anyway, he won't be complaining about that. Fernando Alonso, as I say, beat the drum in many ways for the medium tyre. He was on the medium. George ran it a lot yesterday and was quick on it, but Fernando was on the medium a lot in FP3 and showed everybody how quick it was. And as a result of that, really, that's why I think Max was on the medium. Obviously George as well, but when you see Alonso going that well on the medium too, you think, yeah, we got to look at that. Lando Norris, Charles Leclerc, Isaac Hadjar, and Alex Albon. P10, good job by Alex Albon. Frightening moment for everybody outside. Not for Alex necessarily, he just felt the back end go in Q1 when half the rear bodywork, the engine cover bodywork, just blew off the car going into what appeared to be the second chicane. Big moment for Alex Albon. Debris everywhere, brought out the red. I feel quite sorry for the mechanics, because the first thing they would think is, was there a fastening issue? We heard on the radio it was something like it just ballooned off or something like that, so it sounds like it was aero. But after a moment like that, a good recovery job by Williams to get the car out again, and also for Alex to go out and just do the job and get into Q3 and then to qualify P10, admittedly, but very good job by them to recover from that. Whereas Carlos Sainz didn't. Carlos Sainz came in obviously in the red, and then in that last, there was about 5 minutes to go after the red, and he had a horrendous traffic drama, which he's shouting and screaming about. And you felt sorry for him, absolutely. But nonetheless, Alex got the lap in, and Carlos didn't. A lot of traffic everywhere. So there was a lot of traffic for everyone. That's about all you can say on this circuit. It's just a constant flow of traffic all the time. And there was a bit of a mini race all the time to see who could get out of the pit lane first at the beginning of these 3 phases of qualifying. McLaren obviously in prime position because their garage is right at the front of the pit lane, which should be good news for them tomorrow in the race as well. But occasionally you saw the Ferraris leapfrogging them, as they did in Q3, and once Max did. But other times Max would just sit in the garage and wait till everybody was out, and 5 minutes later he'd deign to go out on the circuit. Those who didn't get through into Q3 and should have include Yuki Tsunoda, who also blamed traffic, but he was never really there. Very disappointing weekend again for Yuki Tsunoda. Franco Colapinto did a good job in the Alpine, got into Q2. First time he's looked like a real racing driver again. Some nice slides coming out of the last chicane as well. Great car control, but still unbelievably wide turn in. Massive Liam Lawson-like leaning on the rear of the car, which is always going to lead to those big oversteer moments, which is why no doubt he had those 2 big spins, shunts were they, in the Brazilian Grand Prix in the wet last year. So Colapinto didn't make it, but he was up there, did a 12-1 like Yuki Tsunoda. Nico Hülkenberg, Oliver Behrmann was also good, and Esteban Ocon in the other Haas just failed to get through into Q3, but all good performances by them. And those who didn't get out of Q1 were Gabriel Bortoleto, Carlos Sainz, Lance Stroll, Liam Lawson, and very surprisingly Pierre Gasly, who was on a quick lap when the Reds came out for the Albon incident in Q1, but then when they went out for the final sprint, just couldn't get any temperature, and the thing was just all over the shop. So as we've been saying, it's going to be an interesting race with a non-McLaren front row, George and Max into turn 1, into turn 2. Be interested to see how they go with tyre wear as well and tyre management. Obviously, whoever's in front is going to be is going to have an advantage in terms of tyre management, and that most likely will be George, I imagine. I can't see him making a slow start, but equally it's a relatively short run from the start-finish line down to the turn-in point of turn 1, and Max is going to be on the inside there. So if George has any sort of wheel spin drama, it's going to be Max Verstappen in front. Anyway, a big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to TrackNinja, and of course to REC Watches. And as I said yesterday, this is your chance for 48 hours. The watch is ticking as I speak to put in a pre-order at the best possible discount price for a soon-to-be released limited edition DNA watch based on the Porsche 956 that finished second at Le Mans in 1985 in the hands of Jonathan Palmer, James Weaver, and Richard Lloyd. Brilliant car, engineered by GTI Engineering, Richard Lloyd's company at the time. Porsche had gone from the original aluminium monocoque to a honeycomb monocoque, but in addition, Richard Lloyd hired Nigel Stroud, one of the top Lotus engineers. You remember he was the engineer on Nigel Mansell's car when Nigel was testing at Silverstone in 1980, and was quicker than, or just right there with Elio. And it was a result of that test with Nigel Stroud that Nigel then got his break in Formula One, his first race. Anyway, Nigel Stroud was then hired by Richard Lloyd to develop the 956. And he did that really well with rising rate front suspension, modified the brakes and some aero parts as well. And that car in 84 won the Brands Hatch 1,000 kilometers in the hands of Jonathan Palmer and Jan Lammers, and then finished second at Le Mans in 85. And it's repurposed brake components from that exact car, chassis number 106B, that form the sundial of this new limited edition DNA REC watch. All the details of how you can order it are in the description below this video, but don't forget, it's a very short period where you can get this amazing discount on the watch. I think I'll be ordering one, that is for sure. So big thanks to our partners, to you the viewer for watching, and we look forward to what no doubt will be a spectacular Canadian Grand Prix tomorrow. We've been saying now for a couple of days, and indeed in the build-up to the Canadian Grand Prix, that this was always going to be a spectacular event, and so it proved. The precursor is that this sort of track doesn't give the McLaren a massive advantage anywhere. It kind of neutralizes some of the great things they have on that car and brings, therefore, the opposition nearer to McLaren. It's not that McLaren do anything badly there, it's just that there aren't enough places to show their advantage. And as a result, we saw Red Bull on occasions, and to some extent in the race, Mercedes specifically, and also Ferrari a little bit, much closer to McLaren than we've seen of late. And beyond that, and because there are walls on some corners, not only on the outside but also on the inside, there are always going to be incidents as well. So this Canadian Grand Prix, in much hotter weather than we'd seen on Friday and Saturday, was going to be about tyre management. This is the softest of the Pirelli range, remember. It was going to be about track position, it was going to be about DRS, and it was going to be about keeping the car on the island. And so it started. George Russell, as predicted, made a very good start from the pole. The clean side, it's kind of clean, semi-dirty there where he was, but it's such a short run down to turn one that all he had to do was make a clean start, which he did, got the lead. Max Verstappen on his outside, no problem at all there, but Oscar Piastri strangely tried to go around the outside of Max coming out of turn two and left the gate right open for Kimi Antonelli. And as a result, he never repassed Kimi Antonelli. We'll get onto that in a little bit, but Antonelli drove really, really well today and backed up everything George was doing and putting pressure on Max Verstappen at exactly the right moments to allow George just to get out and do what he needed to do in the front of the race. Max was always the first to stop in the battle against George Russell. The top half of the grid basically started on medium tyres. The back half of the grid basically started on hard tyres. There were some exceptions, of course, because at the top half, Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc, both of whom had poor qualifying sessions, decided to take the gamble and start on the hard tyre and gain track position with the first pit stops. And it was a good call, that, because the medium tyre went off surprisingly quickly. 15, 16 laps. Generally speaking, Red Bull couldn't get their tyres to stay in a sweet spot, be they medium or hard, for more than about 20 genuine laps. Yes, of course, Max could nurse it, and as the race went on and the fuel got lighter, he could go fast, slow. He could use DRS, he could use the traffic a little bit. But generally speaking, Mercedes had a 5 to 6 lap advantage over Red Bull in terms of how they use the tyres. Tyre temperature, tyre wear, tyre degradation, and also graining we saw in the first phase of the race, not so much in the back half of the race. And overall, over the full race distance, Mercedes a much better car in terms of managing its tyres. So full credit to the work they've done on that. Red Bull, meanwhile, don't seem to have made much progress in terms of how they manage the tyres. At a weekend when McLaren were not going to be their biggest opposition, and obviously from Red Bull's point of view, this was a real opportunity to win the Grand Prix. So let's talk about Mercedes. Absolutely perfect Grand Prix for George Russell. The second pit stop was delayed a little bit with the left rear, but there was no panic. It was just, right, boys, just get it on nicely. And they lost a couple of seconds, but it was enough for George still effectively to retain the lead. And after that, it was just a question of controlling the pace. Max had traffic, George had traffic. Max had pressure also from Kimi Antonelli at various stages, particularly when the tyres were fresh. And that was a great example of how well balanced the Mercedes team is now with these two drivers. You've got George Russell, super quick, super experienced, very confident, on a roll. And you've got Kimi Antonelli, who's young, keen to learn, plays the team role absolutely perfectly, and quick enough this weekend to put a lot of pressure on Max when Max didn't need it. When he was looking after his tyres, there was Kimi Antonelli filling his mirrors and forcing Max to come in for a slightly earlier pit stop than perhaps otherwise have made if it had, say, I don't know, Yuki Tsunoda in the other car. As for Yuki, yeah, he started near the back, but he droned rounds, but didn't play any role at all in Red Bull's defense of second place or even trying to help Max win this Grand Prix. So that was it. Basically, Max could get within about 2 seconds of George, but he could, apart from the early laps of the race when he was in DRS and he was able to sit behind George, but then the tyres went off after about 6 laps, started to degrade after 6 laps. Apart from that, he could never get into DRS range of George Russell, and George therefore had that advantage and took it right through to the end of the race. There was, under the safety car conditions, there was a little bit of a skirmish. I said Max v George 2.0 in the thumbnail of the video yesterday. There wasn't too much going on in terms of needle until they were behind the safety car, when on the back straight leading up to the last corner. From Max's point of view, George suddenly braked much too hard, too suddenly, forcing Max to go to the outside and effectively put a nose in front behind the safety car. And before George could get on the radio to say, Max just passed me under the safety car, Max is on the radio saying, George is braking in a very weird way and I was forced to avoid him. So I don't think any further action will be taken there. Red Bull got on the radio to Max to say, look, don't rise to the what they described as sportsmanship. I'm sure George Russell would say, no, I didn't brake too early. It didn't do anything. So yeah, it was just two things. They shook hands and they were very professional after the race. Kimi Antonelli, before the race, it was quite interesting when they were standing there waiting for the anthem. He was chatting to Max, and he was looking at Max like this, sort of looking at Max. Wow, there's Max Verstappen. I'm next to Max, and then it was like, shall I speak to him or not? And then he said something, and Max sort of looked around and smiled at him, and they had a bit of a chat. It was just a nice moment of this superstar of the next generation talking to this superstar of the current generation, and George Russell has to be included in there as well. So let's get on to McLaren then, because I suppose we have to look at this in a number of ways. One is over last winter, most of the talk was how Lando Norris was going to win the World Championship. I'm talking about the British press now. Going to win the World Championship, and was he going to be up to racing against Max Verstappen or Charles Leclerc? Could he do it? It was very clear, as I tried to point out over the winter, that the only real opponent Lando was going to have was Oscar Piastri in the other McLaren. And certainly we had our doubts last winter about whether Lando was going to be able to do that. And he was going to have to drive differently and approach his whole racing weekend differently if he was going to take it to Oscar Piastri. And then above all, we were saying Zach's master plan. We're saying that because he had no hesitation in effectively firing Daniel Ricciardo as the teammate for Lando Norris and replacing him with Oscar Piastri. And the millisecond he did that, it was very clear that there were going to be moments like the one we saw in Canada today. And so you'd think if this is a big if Zach Brown wants above all Lando Norris to be world champion this year, because he's been his guy since he was in a pram, then putting Oscar alongside him in the other car was never going to be the right way to get the best from Lando. Always great to have the two best drivers you can. That's the philosophy, I think, of most of the Formula One fans out there. I don't agree with it, but anyway, that is the philosophy of most of them. And for a while, I think that philosophy was proved to be 100% correct in the Canadian Grand Prix, because Lando, because he didn't qualify well, because he made that mistake going into the last chicane in his first run in Q3 and then lost momentum. And they changed the wishbones and various other parts, the steering arm on Lando's car before the race, interestingly, in Parc Fermé. Don't think he hit anything, though. Very strange. Anyway, because Lando was starting where he was, as I said, they took the gamble and started him on the hard tyres. Not a difficult gamble to take if you are where Lando is, not much to lose. But as it turned out, in the weather conditions they had and the way the track was going, it was a great call for him and for Charles Leclerc, although the hard tyres didn't go quite as well early on for Charles as they did for Lando. But for Lando, it was great, and it allowed him effectively to get right up behind Oscar Piastri in the closing laps of the race. Pit stops were different, everything was different, but it allowed him to get there. It was a better call. And anyway, Lando, as I said yesterday, was actually getting a little bit more from the McLaren in Canada. He's driving the front of the car more than Oscar, who's obviously uses the rear more, and that's the way he's driving in 2025. But Lando was very, very good around Canada. And as they approached the last 15 laps, he was right behind Oscar Piastri. His tyres are 2 laps newer on the hard tyre, everybody on the same compound. So there was no question now. This was the first time I think we've seen this year where McLaren have got both their drivers basically on the same strategy in terms of racing to the checkered flag. And Lando Norris is behind Oscar Piastri, going quicker, his tyres in slightly better shape. And it was the first time the pressure's been on McLaren to have to make any sort of call. And of course, they didn't make any sort of call, because there was Oscar Piastri doing a very good job in P4, putting pressure on Kimi Antonelli, indeed in DRS range of Kimi Antonelli. And meanwhile, Lando going slightly quicker than Oscar. So from Lando's point of view, he couldn't use DRS to get past Oscar Piastri, because Oscar was benefiting from the DRS. It was the DRS train, as they say, from Kimi Antonelli. And Kimi Antonelli, again, in brackets, I've got to say, just brilliant in defence as well, with Oscar Piastri behind him, darting all over the place, going into that last chicane with DRS. Kimi, no mistakes in terms of high-speed braking as well, so 100% hats off to him. He did a great job there. Anyway, there's Lando darting in turn behind Oscar Piastri. And you wonder what's going to happen, because McLaren are not going to make a call. They wouldn't know what to say. I predicted in a live stream a couple of weeks ago that if we got to this situation and it wasn't for the race win, that Oscar Piastri might, just to make things easy, let Lando past. Not much to lose from Oscar's point of view if he's not going to win the race anyway, and score a massive number of internal political points at McLaren that may well serve him going down the road towards the climax of the World Championship this year. And I speculated that I thought that's probably what Oscar would do in this situation. But he didn't. I forgot the one thing. He's a hard-charging Aussie racing driver in the way of Jack Brabham, as I said a few times. Head down, he was never, ever going to give that position up to Lando Norris unless he made some sort of mistake or did something wrong. Anyway, 3 or 4 laps from the end of the race, Lando comes down inside Oscar into the hairpin, the famous hairpin before the long straight. He knows he's got DRS again because the detection point is just before that. And he goes down the inside of Oscar, but then runs wide. You call that a mistake from Lando Norris because it really wasn't an overtake, because Oscar got his braking absolutely perfect and Lando ran a little bit wide. So as they came out of the corner, Oscar's back down the inside, full on power, acceleration. Lando's on the left, but has momentum. He stays on the power, holds the situation quite well. And as they accelerate onto the straight, Lando's got the momentum and starts to pull alongside Oscar Piastri. It looks good, except for one thing. Oscar's got the inside run down into the last corner. And there's no way in the world he's going to give that position to Lando Norris. I imagine at McLaren, they've never been in this situation before, I don't think, like this, at high speed, going down the straight like that between their two drivers, with Oscar quite clearly racing for the position. They've never been in that position before, and I guess they were all white knuckle on the pit wall. And as they get to the braking zone, Lando just has to give the position to Oscar and filters in behind him. And doesn't have a moment going in dirty air into that chicane, but comes out right behind Oscar, moves to the left. Oscar's sort of covering him as well, goes to the center of the road, perfectly positioning his car. I've got to say, absolutely perfect. He's not on the right, he's not on the left, he's just center left. And there's a tiny diminishing gap for Lando Norris to go on the left now. And it was a similar thing to Lewis Hamilton with Jenson Button, as I say, in the McLarens, because Lando just goes down the gap and it's as if he doesn't realize the pit wall's there. He's on the grass and suddenly hits the pit wall. And of course, the track does start to curve there as well. That's the other point. And takes the left front off the car. Now, all I would say, McLaren are probably devastated that they lost that position, that result for Lando Norris, and the car ended up with that damage. But that is what you're going to get if you have somebody as quick as Lando Norris alongside somebody as quick as Oscar Piastri. And obviously, it goes without saying, but I'll say it, if Daniel Ricciardo was in the other car and it was Lando Norris, that wouldn't have happened. And Lando probably would have had I don't know, maybe even a P3, he might have even got Antonelli. But anyway, they don't. They got Oscar Piastri, an absolute racer, and you cannot in any way criticize anything he did. He was absolutely clean as anything, and I thought it was actually incredibly good how Lando reacted to that. He was immediately on the radio, taking all the blame himself. I can't think of many racing drivers in that situation who would have done that. I mean, if that was Nigel Mansell or Michael Schumacher or Niki Lauda, especially Niki Lauda, I think they all would have found some way of blaming the other guy or the team or something. That's what racing drivers do. But Lando was there taking all the blame for himself and then lost no time walking back to the pits. You can see in the background, the brakes, I think, started to catch fire, but there's Lando walking away from it, gets back to the McLaren garage. And about the first thing he does is go up to Oscar and shake Oscar's hand and say, look, no problem. It wasn't your fault at all. I suppose a lot of people say Lando's too nice. And maybe he is. I'm not sure that this is a bad thing we're seeing from Lando Norris there. I think that's probably a very good thing, very human thing, and it shows that he's a very good, honest person. But at the same time, he has to find the way, as I've been saying for 6 months now, to take the championship to Oscar Piastri. He can't continue to be the nice guy. And again, if that was Max racing with, I don't know, in the Daniel Ricciardo days when Daniel was at Red Bull, or if that was Mansell and Piquet, for example, or Senna and Prost, with that both cars very, very quick, there's no way they would have spent 3 or 4 laps like Lando trying to get past Oscar. It would have just been a forceful move the minute he got somewhere near him under the rear wing. But because Lando's such a good team player and because he loves McLaren and Zach, he just took too long. He was too long behind Oscar. And by the time, he was there, it was easy for Oscar just to keep the car on the road. So that was a seminal moment, I think, for everyone, for McLaren, for Lando Norris, for Oscar Piastri certainly, who didn't win the race, but now has a massive advantage in terms of the points he got over Lando Norris. He has to work very hard to get the sort of advantage he got today over Lando Norris in one race. And that's a big step for him in terms of the World Championship. So for Oscar Piastri, what a result. P4, Lando Norris nowhere. P5, Charles Leclerc, who did very well after that very poor qualifying as well. He started on the hard tyre just like Lando, but unlike Lando, he didn't go to mediums at the first stop. He went to the hard tyre again, and it was quite clear, obviously, he was going to have to make a stop late in the race. But there was the usual argy-bargy on the radio where they got on the radio and said, we are thinking of staying on plan B, Charles. And Charles said, no, I think plan C. And they said, copy that. which I guess if you're Charles Leclerc means, yeah, okay, we're going to be on plan C, which presumably meant he was going to run longer, try and do either one stop or maybe stop right at the end and put softs on or something, I don't know. But they brought him in earlier than Charles thought. And he said in response, why are you bringing me in so early? And they said, well, plan B. And he said, well, I said the tyres were okay. And he could have said, and I said, let's go to plan C, as I said on the radio. But there was no response after that. And again, you know, that sort of thing, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievably unprofessional, I think, that can still happen at Ferrari in the middle of a race, that sort of misunderstanding. You know, why say copy that when Charles Leclerc says, no, not plan B, we'll go to plan C. They say copy that. Then quite clearly, they're still going to stick to plan B. That's what would have irritated Charles Leclerc. Anyway, he easily beat Lewis Hamilton, who was on a fairly standard tyre strategy, but not that quick, got involved in quite a lot of traffic as well when he came out of his pit stops. And on top of all that, he ran into a groundhog, sadly, and that caused quite a lot of damage to the underside of the car. But that, of course, bunched them all up with the safety car right at the end. So in terms of results, therefore, it was Ferrari 5th and 6th. But a disappointing weekend for them all together. Charles having that shunt on Friday, totally unnecessarily, on a weekend when they could have been much nearer to McLaren. And I think they would have been much nearer to McLaren if they'd had a clean weekend and really been able to do some decent homework. I think Charles Leclerc could have been a lot higher than that. So disappointing weekend for them. P7, Fernando Alonso, very good job in the Aston Martin. Just got the maximum from that car. Very good. And I think Fernando was quite correct after the race to be irritated by Lewis Hamilton crossing the line a full 7 seconds behind Charles Leclerc, because as Fernando pointed out, and he's quite correct, these days there are so many potential protests, so many potential penalties. Some of them are 5-second penalties. So it behoves you behind the safety car to make sure that you're at least 5 seconds, within 5 seconds of the car in front of you. And Lewis wasn't. He was 7 seconds behind Leclerc. And Fernando was right on his tail in those safety car conditions, trying to get Lewis to get closer to Leclerc. But he didn't respond. It was an extraordinary lapse of racing nous by Lewis in that situation. Nico Hülkenberg benefited quite early on the opening lap, indeed, when Alex Albon got him into a skirmish at the second chicane, and Nico just went straight through the lot of it and brought the car home, brought the Sauber home again in the points. Carlos Sainz, who chose to go to Williams because there was a bigger opportunity to score points there. Please note, Carlos, Esteban Ocon, 9th. Very good job by Esteban in the Haas Ferrari. He's put in a couple of good races now, hasn't he? And Carlos Sainz, 10th in the Williams. As I say, very good drive by Carlos down at where he was, down at the back of the grid, but nonetheless still behind Nico Hülkenberg in the Sauber, as I say. Oliver Behrman, P11, and Yuki Tsunoda eventually finished P12. I suppose you could say quite a good drive from where he was on the grid, but in terms of actually helping Red Bull, absolutely zero help there. There was a bit of a South American battle for P13 between Franco Colapinto and Gabriel Bortoleto. Eventually went in the favour of Colapinto in the Alpine. So that's his first decent result since he was drafted in to replace Jack Doohan. But I reiterate what I've always been saying. I'd love to see Jack Doohan back in that car. Pierre Gasly had started from the pit lane, made lots of changes of the car because why not? Finished 15th. And Isaac Hadjar, for once, didn't have a good Grand Prix. He finished 16th. Lots of things went wrong, and he got a 3-place grid penalty. So he wasn't even in the top 10 on the grid for that balking incident we talked about yesterday with Carlos Sainz. So, yeah, a dramatic, spectacular Canadian Grand Prix. Lots of action, lots of tension in the build-up to where they were going to be with 10 laps to go. It was a good race from that point of view. Lots of different strategies, lots of pit stops, lots of changes of position as a result of those pit stops. And then it all came to a head in those last 10 laps, the McLaren shunt, and also the way George Russell exercised his muscles and pulled away just when he needed to from Max Verstappen. A very controlled drive by George. Beautiful to see. And Max, I think, got 100% from a Red Bull that wasn't particularly good in terms of its tyre management, as even compared with Mercedes. It was pretty bad. And Max still managed to finish P2 while his teammate was in P12. And Kimi Antonelli, a superb drive into P3, holding off massive pressure from Oscar Piastri in the McLaren Mercedes. Before we go, a big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to TrackNinja, and of course to RAC Watches. Don't forget that there is a limited time offer to do a pre-order on the amazing new Porsche 956 DNA watch created by REC around repurposed brake materials from that car. Finished second at Le Mans in 1985, won the Brands Hatch 1,000 kilometers in 1984. Classic Porsche, if ever there was one, chassis 106B. And I say glibly that it finished second at Le Mans in 1985. It was actually the quickest 956. Probably would have won Le Mans in 1985 with James Weaver, Jonathan Palmer, and Richard Lloyd doing a stint as well at the wheel, but they did have some mechanical problems and they still nonetheless finished second. So a great result for that car, for that team. And you can have a part of that history with this new watch that REC have produced. And you can register for the pre-order by going to the link in the description below this video. Speaking of Le Mans, congratulations to this year's winners. AF Corsa, the yellow Ferrari. Very good to see Robert Kubica at the wheel of that car. But I was particularly pleased too to see Yifei Ye in that car. I interviewed Yifei, or Ye I think we called him then, 10 years ago when he was doing French Formula 4. And he was living in what was effectively a sort of boarding school, converted boarding school for young French drivers put together by the FFSA, the French Racing Federation, at Le Mans, would you believe? And I interviewed him then because he just won a couple of races in this French Formula 4 championship. And I love the way he drives. And I always felt he was destined for great things. And I always felt, I have to say, that he was the choice Chinese driver rather than Guan Yu Zhou. And I think had he gone into Formula One, I think he would be very, very quick. But he didn't have the money, unlike Guan Yu. And so he went into sports cars. And here he is winning Le Mans now for Ferrari. Really good to see. Congratulations to him. So there we are, Canadian Grand Prix at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. Another spectacular race. Brilliant. See you soon. We'll be back with live streams, with cam chat, and all the other stuff in the build-up to the next round of the World Championship. Until then, thanks for watching. Take care. See you soon.